Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Zero to Empire podcast. On this episode, I have Kurt Richardson. He's the executive and leadership coach, and this is going to be a very solid episode. Pay attention to the whole thing or listen if you're watching. And yeah, I'm excited to have Kurt on this episode. He has a lot to say and a lot of meaningful things to talk about. So, Kurt, thank you for being on the podcast. And you actually served in aviation for years before actually moving into the coaching space. So, what actually drew you to moving into leadership coaching and aviation in the beginning?
Okay, I'll be glad to answer that. And thanks for having me on the podcast, Sam. I appreciate it. In aviation, I started off on the shop floor. I worked my way up through the various levels, ending up my career as a president general manager over a aviation facility here in Texas. And during that time, I was helped by a lot of people, mentored and coached. As a lead person in the shop, I had a manager who moved me around to every single shop, had me run every single machine. And so 6 months later, when I made supervisor, I had a big jump on a lot of people because I knew the machines, I knew the people. And then as a supervisor, every 6 months, I got moved to a different shop, and that really built up, had me work through areas I'd never worked before. I had to work through people, and so I've been supported by a lot of people. And so kind of in the last half of my career, there's two things I was really passionate about. One was lean manufacturing, which is improving your processes, taking out waste, improving quality, mistake proofing processes so you didn't make mistakes that you made in the past again. And the other one was mentoring leaders. I'd been mentored, I'd been coached, I've been given a lot of opportunities. And, after 4 decades in aviation, I've learned a lot. I've made a lot of mistakes. I say, success comes from experience, and experience comes from learning from your mistakes. So I've made mistakes. I've learned, what's effective. And, key thing to me was mentoring younger leaders, bringing them up, giving them the same opportunity that I had. I feel grateful, and I feel like I got an obligation, to mentor them. So when I retired, I thought, well, I'm not with a large organization anymore, and I'm not in an executive role. I probably won't have a chance to mentor. So, my passions are mentoring. I love animals, especially dogs, and I love being role models to kids. So I actually, once I retired, I thought, well, maybe I'll work for the Humane Society. Maybe I'll be a crossing guard. Maybe I'll be a bus driver. Maybe I'll be a volunteer in the schools. And then I had a discussion with a fellow colleague that I worked with at Boeing Spirit Aerosystems. And she was somebody I really respected. She was a retired colonel in the military and one of the best leaders, I've ever known. And we were having a discussion, and she told me about doing leadership coaching and going through a program, and how rewarding that was and how you can give back. And she said, Kurt, I think you'd be an excellent leadership coach. And that kind of opened the door for me. It opened my eyes. I never thought actually about the ability to mentor, after I retired. So then I did some studying, did some research, found Georgetown. It was kind of the gold standard as far as leadership coaching. And so I went through their program in 2023 because I wanted to have the tools to add with the experience I have. So, something I offer clients is not only have I been through it, I've been through every level of leadership, and so I've got a lot of experience to bring to the table, but I've also got the educational tools now to combine with that. So, it's something I offer.
That's solid, and that's quite the story. I'm glad that you're coaching here today. That's impressive with your aviation background as well, with decades. And so, to go into the aviation background that you had for a long time, how'd that actually shape your coaching style today?
So, when I told you when I was in aviation, I worked through all the different levels, and I found out, several things. Like, one, be yourself. When I first went in, I tried to emulate my boss, and I found out, you just have to be yourself. But in aviation, other things in there. When I became an executive, at Spirit, the CEO had a philosophy that after 2 years, you feel comfortable in a job. It really takes you 2 years going through firefights and budget activities and yearly things. And usually after 2 years, a person feels pretty confident, in the job they've held. And so when you hit the 2-year mark at Spirit, they would move you to another place. They'd move me to a completely different place that I'd never worked before. I didn't know the process. I didn't know the people. So it made me a better leader because I had to work through my people. I had to ask questions. I had to go out on the shop floor, and I've always believed in kind of an inverted pyramid, servant leadership, that I work for everybody else. If I can get the leaders, the people on the shop floor, the tools they need and help them be successful, then we'll be successful as a company. So that's kind of helped shape me. I wanted to give back. I've been developed. I've been supported, and so that's kind of guided me. And also, my father worked at the same company I did. He retired after 44 years there, and he taught me a lot about hard work and loyalty and respect and having difficult conversations with people that are really important for people to be successful. I mean, people need to hear the good things they're doing, and they also need to hear areas they need to improve in, and that's really important. And most people want to know that. They want to know what their boss is thinking. And I don't know how many times people have went into a performance review and their boss has said, "Hey, you're doing good. Just keep up what you're doing," And that doesn't help a person. It doesn't help a person grow, because there's some things, you can do better, and your boss didn't put much effort into it. So I always, to kind of work through that, I always ask my boss, "Hey, can you tell me 3 things I've done well and 3 things you think I could improve on?" And then when I had my performance reviews with the people that worked for me, I did the same thing. I said, "I want you to think of 3 things you do good and 3 things you think you can improve on." But I took it a step further, and I asked them to think of 3 things that I did well and 3 things they thought I could improve on, which sometimes they were a little bit leery. But, if I went first and said, "Here's what I think my strengths are, and here's some things I think I can work on," it kind of broke the ice and maybe made them feel a little better. Some people don't like to tell their boss, "Here's some things I think you could do better." But I learned so much from that. They say, "Hey, I don't feel like we know enough about what's going on in this type of situation." I'm like, "Okay, that's good input." So I'll work on doing that. And my bosses, I had a boss that told me once, "You send me emails and I don't know when you're asking for my help and when you're not," which I always put FYI at the beginning of emails, which to me means for your information. I don't need any action. So I went overboard saying, "I'm giving you this so that you won't be surprised in a meeting. No action needed. I've got it taken care of." Matter of fact, if I figured if I needed my boss's help, I probably wasn't quite at the level of leadership I should be at. But, kind of those things, what my dad taught me, and the training that I went through and the guiding and mentoring that I went through is really what shapes my leadership coaching style, and helped me be successful.
Yeah, that's a good approach to do 3 things that are positive and 3 things that you can be working on. It's always good to have both. And it's a good approach to do that moving forward. And who would you say is your ideal client for coaching today?
So I work with both first levels, and executives. And I like to see, people come in that are serious and sincere about wanting to improve and wanting to do the work. And I'm kind of at an advantage because since I'm retired, I don't have to do coaching for a living. I've got retirement, I've got a pension coming, I got things like that. So I can be a little pickier. And so, when I have a discovery call with clients, I learn about them. I learn how committed they are, how hungry they are to want to do the work, because it's hard work to do self-assessment on yourself and apply where your weaknesses. And I'll give you some examples of that a little later. But I have clients that range from a COO of a large aviation company to a general manager of an HOA to a brilliant chiropractor who's opening his own business, built a building, is opening his own business, to an athletic director at a big high school to a CFO, at a mid-sized manufacturing company. It's really, and you've heard of the Peter Principle, but the Peter Principle says people rise to their level of incompetence. They'll rise until they get to the point where they stop performing just because maybe they haven't developed enough, or it's education or background or something like that. And so, you could hit that. You could be a first level and struggling. You could be a middle level manager and struggling. You could be an executive, and have hit that point where you feel like I'm really struggling in the position. And so, I'll take on any level of client, and I have, all levels of clients, and, I'll work with them. The biggest thing I start with is like above the line, below the line behavior. I work on self-awareness. Do they know what their weaknesses are? Do they know what their strengths are? How do you uncover that if you don't have a good idea about it? And there's some just easy tools I give them, like I'm do a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat on themselves. Identify 3 for each one of them. I have them go to their boss and then 3 other peers, or maybe somebody that works for them, and ask them, what's one thing I do well, and what's one thing you think I can improve on? And both those exercises are pretty eye-opening, and believe it or not, a lot of the biggest surprises when they self-analyze themselves and do a SWOT analysis. They also have them journal, like when you're in meetings, what goes well, what doesn't. Do you ask questions when you have them? Do you speak up when you have them? How do you feel about certain type of conversations? How do you feel during different conversations? And all those kind of create self-awareness and help drive our coaching, to where it needs to go.
Nice. I really like that. And can you actually go what you're talking about with the examples of a client whose actually growth surprised you by going through your coachings?
Yeah, I can. So one of them I mentioned was it's a lady CFO. She's probably been in the workforce 12, 15 years. So she's fairly young to be a CFO. And I had a person that I worked with who was a consultant that I'd worked with for years and I know real well. And we were in a catch-up phone call, and I told him about what I was doing at Georgetown and the coaching. And he said, hey, I've got a lady that just got promoted to CFO. She's really unsure of herself. She needs to be more assertive. And I think she could really benefit, from your leadership coaching. And he introduced us, and I had a discovery call with her, and I could tell she was very sincere about wanting to improve. And she had some specific things she needed to improve on. And, but she didn't know how coaching worked. She said, I'm just not real sure. I don't know. So in this particular case, I don't do this all the time, but I offered to coach her for 2 months for free every other week. So I coached her 4 times. I said, how about I just coach you for 2 months for free, no obligation. At the end of 2 months, let's talk. If you want to continue, we'll sign a contract. If you don't, you got 2 months of free coaching, And so at the end of the 2 months, she said, yeah, I want to continue this. And she's been with me for 18 months. But when we first started, assertiveness was something she really needed to work on. And we had a 3-way call with her and her boss, the CEO of the company. And he said assertiveness, we asked him, what are some things, you'd like to see us focus on? He gave us 5 or 6 items, but the top one was, was assertiveness. And so we started working on assertiveness with her. And I did things like I had her watch a master class by Kim Scott called Radical Candor, which is excellent. And it's 3 hours. It's like 5 to 10 minute role playing of different scenarios, how to handle different situations, how to have development conversations, how to have performance improvement conversations. So she went through that, and I developed 5 tips to be more assertive for an introvert, because she said, Kurt, I'm really more of an introvert than anything. And so she said that makes it even tougher. So we worked on that, like posture, the language you use, not using filler words like and ahs and I don't, and knows, things like that, and looking people in the eye, and things to gain her confidence. And then I introduced her to a book and a a process by Mel Robbins called the 5-second rule. It's a book she's got out. And it really says if you're going to take action, if you're going to do something, the psychology of it says that if you wait more than 5 seconds, that you won't do it. And Mel gives the example of in the morning when our alarm goes off, she repeatedly would hit the snooze button. She said, I'd hit it 4, 5, 6 times. She said, when I started using the 5-second rule, you count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then you do it. You don't think about it, you just do it. She said, you count down so you don't count up, because if you start counting up, you can just keep going, but you count down. And so I talked her to using that in meetings. Like, if you got a question, do you use the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and ask your question? If you got a comment, use the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and ask your comment. And so that was effective. And then when she's having difficult conversations, and she talked about, I'm kind of stressed out. It's a difficult conversation. Here's the person I'm having it with. I never described the person, how he'd react. And then we do 4, 5, 6 role playing, where I would pretend to be that person and I would exhibit the behaviors that she told me about him, and then sometimes I would change it and I'd throw in, or I'd be a little tougher, or I'd be a little easier, so we do it different ways. And then we'd switch, and I'd have her be him and I'd be her, just so she could see maybe some ways I used or some tools I used. And so through those things, when I first started with her, I said, I use this pretty frequently on like self-awareness. On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put yourself in assertiveness? And she said, I'd put myself a 4. And so slowly over about 9 months to a year time frame, she went to a 5, to a 6, to a 7, and now she thinks she's at an 8. And she's told me stories about, like, she'd be in a leadership meeting and the CEO brought something up and she disagreed with him. And she said, I disagree with you. And he said, tell me why. And she went through the reasons why. And he said, okay, that makes sense. He said, I agree with you. And she said, Kurt, 9 months ago, I would have never done that. I would have never disagreed with the CEO. So, it made me feel good. And I can see her growing in confidence. And I'll just give one more quick example, but I've got a guy that is an IT professional that I've been coaching for like 3 or 4 months now. And we've been going through it. And I said, hey, talk to your leader tell him that you're going through leadership coaching. He's having to be paying for it out of his own pocket, where a lot of companies will pay for leadership development, and talk to him about some of the things we're doing. And his boss actually knew, because he went to him and said, hey, what's one thing I do good? One thing I need to improve on. And the boss started saying, well, why are you asking me that? And then he started going with a more structured agenda, talking to his boss. He used to just go in and off the cuff, what he got to talk about, and they wouldn't have much. It started going the structured agenda, and we had a coaching call last night, and he texted me 2 or 3 days ago and said, hey, my boss said, based on what I'm doing leadership wise and where I'm at, he's put me over as a lead over a big IT project, working with multiple groups. And he said, I'm nervous, but I'm excited. And I said, this is what you work forward to. And development comes when you get out of your comfort zone. When you start getting uncomfortable and you work, but the more you do that, the easier it gets. It's kind of like, building up a muscle, using courage. So, coaching requires change, and change requires action. So I feel good about that. But just seeing the clients rate themselves, at a higher level, and seeing them do things and then come back and saying, hey, here's something I did in a meeting I'm really proud of, it's really rewarding.
Oh yeah, super rewarding. And I'm glad you're able to make that impact on them in such a positive way. So if those that are interested in getting your coaching today, where can they find you, reach out to you, etc.?
So they can find me on LinkedIn. It's Kurt, K-U-R-T, Richardson, MBA. There's like several Kurt Richardson. So they put the MBA, it'll come directly to me. Or they could email me. My email is Kurt, K-U-R-T, Wayne, W-Y-N-E, Richardson @yahoo.com.
Awesome, Kurt. If anybody is interested in getting his coaching, make sure to go check him out and get the discovery call with him. And thanks so much for being on the podcast, Kurt. It was great having you. And thank you also for everyone listening and watching in on this episode of Zero to Empire. I'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, Sam.